Please have a seat. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Told their children to run into the bathtub when they hear gunfire on the street outside because it is the safest place in the home from a stray bullet.
There are too many survivors and advocates here for me to name it. You bought a gun. Take a look. Take a look at this. It comes in this package. You can see the picture down here. Maybe.
Frame
This
or
is
receipt.
the gun. Here maybe. This is the gun. It's not hard to put together.
At least they can't just make law, right?
A year ago this week, standing here with many of you, I instructed the Attorney General to write a regulation that would rein in the proliferation of ghost guns because I was having trouble getting anything passed in the Congress. But I used what we call regulatory authority. And I said, what do you think, the deer you're hunting or wear Kevlar vests? What the hell you need 20 bullets for? You must be a hell of a terrible shot. I'm serious. Think about it.
Okay, guys, let's talk about this. ATF just dropped their final rule covering the new definition of frame or receiver. They're messing around with silencers, they're diddling with FFL requirements, and more. This is a big, fat document, and I'm still tearing through it, but I thought it would be good to jump ahead of it before misinformation and nonsense takes an aggressive hold. Speaking of which, I've been amazed at how other gun tubers were able to read a 364-page document, digest it, understand it, and release a video within 3 hours of the document's release. That's so cool. Anyway, let's take a look at some of the things this rule's trying to do, what it's not trying to do, and what the practical effects might be for us. First of all, let's talk about the process that ATF is using right here, the administrative rulemaking. Administrative agencies like the ATF are tasked with enforcing certain laws and making rules to clarify these efforts. They are not tasked with, nor do they have the power, to make new law. So keep that in mind as we discuss what this rule is attempting to accomplish. The final rule, which will take effect in about 120 days, targets a few different areas. The big one that most of us are concerned about is about incomplete receivers and privately made firearms. So now what this rule is trying to do. It changes the definition of frame or receiver, which is found in the Gun Control Act. It's a term that's appended to the definition of firearm. ATF in this rulemaking is changing its definition of this term from a short statement to a multi-page long cross-referenced mess complete with new terms and sub-definitions while invalidating all previous determinations regarding unfinished receivers. As it applies to unfinished receivers, the definition now includes partially complete, disassembled, or non-functional frames or receivers. This definition, which is what we are most concerned with, is as clear as dry mud. It all hinges on whether or not the unfinished receiver, which we colloquially call 80%, are designed to or may be readily made into a functional receiver. Of course, readily has its own definition, which hinges on whether it is fairly or reasonably efficient, quick, and easy to do. So much for clarification, right? ATF has some examples listed, 3 of which explaining situations in which something would be considered a firearm and 2 of which in which it would not. Let's go through them. Example 1, a parts kit sold with a partially completed receiver blank which comes with a complete jig or a template. According to ATF, this is a firearm because a person could find instructions online and use common hand tools to readily complete the receiver or parts kit into a functional firearm. Example 2, a partially finished receiver blank with 1 or more template holes drilled or indexed in the correct location. According to ATF, this is a firearm because somebody with hand tools could reasonably complete the blank to function as a frame or receiver. Of course, ATF doesn't mention which holes they're talking about, whether they be fire control holes or otherwise. All I really get from this example is that ATF continues to maintain an unhealthy fixation with the concept of indexing, and that ATF thinks a piece of paper with lines drawn on it is in fact a paper airplane. Example 3. A complete frame or receiver that has been disassembled, damaged, split, or cut into pieces, but not destroyed in accordance with paragraph E. According to ATF, this is still a receiver, which is a massive departure from the many, many decades of practice that a firearm, one that is already inside the US, ceases to be a firearm once the receiver is disintegrated or cut at all. So what does paragraph E suggest? Well, completely melting it, tearing it to shreds, or otherwise destroying it in a manner ATF now enjoys. Does this mean that reweldable parts kits will disappear? I wish I had an answer. It isn't clear, but this is concerning for people who trade in older saw-cut parts kits. Example 4. An AR-15 receiver blank where the critical interior angles have not been machined, indexed, or formed, that is not sold, distributed, or possessed with instructions, jigs, or equipment to readily complete it. According to ATF, this is not a firearm. ATF also separately wrote that a partially complete receiver alone is not legally a firearm if it still requires performance of certain machining operations, but the inclusion or possession of jigs and tools apparently upsets them. Now, people have been asking me, does this mean that, as far as ARs go, you need to just buy the blank and the jigs from two separate companies? I don't know. The rule is insane. It all depends on whether they consider that particular blank kind of easy or reasonable to do, as we'll discuss later. Anyway, example 5. A flat blank of an AK variant receiver without laser cuts or indexing that is not sold, distributed, or possessed with instructions, jigs, templates, equipment, or tools. According to ATF, this is not a receiver because a person cannot readily do the thing or whatever. Of course, note that this list is, according to them, non-exhaustive, and so you can't really pull that much from it. We don't immediately know what is, for example, a AK flat with holes in it. We just don't know. I also think it's interesting to note that ATF itself considers this definition so vague that it found it necessary to specifically exclude unmachined blocks of metal, liquid polymers, or other raw materials from the definition. Yikes. While the rule does nothing to ban the homemaking of firearms, it does require that any FFL who has a privately made firearm in their possession for more than a day serialize the firearm. FFLs holding your homemade firearm for less than a day for minor repair and adjustments, though, do not need to mark them. But if they keep it overnight, it looks like they need to install a serial number plate. This is an obvious problem, as many 3D printed frames and receivers have no metal components and are not required by federal law to have them. Of course, ATF has seemed to require that serialization be done in metal. So this sets up a horrible snafu. Any FFL who comes into possession of a privately made gun then has to figure out a way to permanently bojangle a metal plate into it so that they can doodle numbers on the plate. It's obvious that ATF is doing this in an attempt to render these firearms traceable, but it's far more likely that this will just make FFLs not want to touch privately made firearms at all, which seems counterproductive to ATF's mission here. As for what is and is not a frame or receiver going forward, let's set this straight. No, AR uppers are not firearms under this rule. ATF states that all prior classifications of which part concerns the receiver or frame on existing firearms are grandfathered for those guns and their variants, including the AR-15, that is, unless ATF changes its mind, which it, of course, leaves itself the option to do. As for new designs, it's a different story. The new rule defines frame and receiver separately, with frame covering handguns and receiver covering long guns. For long guns, the receiver will be that part into which the bolt locks or otherwise interacts with the breech. So if the AR-15 were a brand new design, it would be the upper. I'd like to take a moment to point out that all of this mess around the AR-15 was just because ATF got all obsessed with fire control groups in the 1960s. Look at just about every other thing they called the receiver on a rifle, with few exceptions. The FAL, the various descendants of the AR-18, all of them were understood in this way. It's literally just because ATF got all freaked out that you might do a full auto swap that they pooped on the table and fixated on the AR lower. And guess what? People do it anyway. Now, I'm not complaining. I like being able to hot swap uppers. But of course, I am of the opinion that a correct reading of federal law involves throwing it in the trash and selling AK-74s in vending machines as the founders intended. but I digress. Aggressively. For handguns which have a frame, it's the part which contains the mechanism that holds back the striker or hammer. So this is the grip zone on most self-loading pistols, save for those famous examples with a trigger cassette like that venerable one adopted by our armed services, the SIG 320. And for revolvers, it is of course the frame which houses the hammer zone. In addition to that mess, the rule calls into question the legal status of parts kits sold with receivers that were not completely melted, shredded, or otherwise destroyed in a method approved by ATF. As for FFLs, which for decades have been able to destroy records of firearm transactions after 20 years, the final rule requires that they keep records indefinitely. The purpose of this, many are concerned, is to enable ATF to amass a searchable database of gun owners by making it so ATF has access to all future transactions done through an FFL. The utility of this is dubious since firearms transferred 20 years ago or even 20 days ago are often not with the person they were then transferred to. For sure, the only way this helps ATF is if there was a universal background check provision, in which case, should they run a trace on a firearm, they can get more people in trouble and lock them in government cages. Bear in mind there too that ATF traces are not to find a gun. They're running the trace because they have the gun. That's how they got the serial number. The only practical purpose for ATF tracing is to whack someone else for potentially maybe perhaps selling it illegally. This is a stark contrast to what gun controllers will have you believe, that tracing is somehow a super sleuth crime-fighting technique. It's not. Firearm traces are literally just a way to get FFLs to either snitch on themselves or hand over a dude who may or may not have handed over the gun, possibly a decade ago, possibly never. It's dumb. It doesn't really help anything. Additionally, the rule states that suppressors will now have a frame or receiver all of their own, which cannot be an end cap. This is partially to clarify all of the manic insane ATF field offices that have been asking suppressor manufacturers to do weird crap like serialized cardboard boxes. Check out my AA12 video for that story. The rule also sets up a new way to mark firearms, which is required for FFLs marking privately made guns and usable by manufacturers and importers going forward using an abbreviation of their FFL number ahead of a unique serial number. There are some minor provisions that talk about the possibility of adopting a serial number that was placed onto the firearm ahead of time, but we wanted to focus on the big point here. The point of this marking, especially on a privately made firearm, is so that should the firearm be recovered and ATF want to do the magic trace, it's super easy to find the FFL it was serialized at, who will then have the owner recorded in their books as a disposition tab. With all of that fun out of the way, let's talk about what the proposed rule does not do. It does not require serialization of AR uppers. I don't know why you guys keep saying that. It does not prevent 3D printing of firearm frames or receivers, nor does it ban home building. And it does not seem to require separate serialization of uppers and lowers as the previous draft threatened to do. You can check my previous videos for more information on that. It was one of the most terrifying parts of the rule, but a buttload of you guys commented and ATF took a step back from asserting that firearms may have multiple frames or receivers as a matter of course. Interestingly, we can glean some of the reasons why they decided to kind of step back from the multiple receiver thing from their responses to the comments. One of which specifically refers to a comment submitted by an association of wind chime artisans who were concerned that ATF's anything can be the receiver suggestion would work a prior restraint on their beautiful, glorious First Amendment protected art. On that much, it's clear that all of the hard work you guys did commenting on the proposed rule was helpful, but this is still very clearly a legislative rulemaking, which is a big constitutional no-no. So what are the practical effects here? How is this likely to affect you? Well, again, we're still looking at this. I don't exactly know. But for right now, it seems that 80% frames or receivers that are sold with templates, jigs, or are otherwise reasonably easy to complete may disappear from the market. We'll see a huge issue in FFLs who hold on to a privately made firearm for more than a day, suddenly required to mark them in compliance with this new vague rule in a way that may or may not be possible. People who deal in old saw-cut parts kits may be imperiled, and we may see a big change in how parts kits are sold. You may have also noticed the definition with respect to incomplete receivers frequently includes language referring to a blank possessed with jigs in addition to sold and distributed with. Possessed with. I don't think this was on accident. It seems to me ATF is positing that you might be able to purchase a blank from X, a jig from Y, and tools from Z. Then, when you own all of them, you have a receiver, regardless of if it's complete. Well, so what, you might be asking? Well, this is likely designed to patch the failed prosecutions ATF has done in the past where they seized records that a prohibited person had purchased an 80% or other precursor part. In these cases, ATF were unable to convict because the court did the right thing and said, "That's not a gun, you doof." If ATF gets their way with this rule, sales records of receiver blanks plus tooling would make for easy prosecutions of prohibited people who may just be holding on to an incomplete receiver in case something bad were to happen. All in all, this rule is whack. One other thing you can expect is a boatload of lawsuits before we get clear answers. A big old boat full of them. Anyway, that's it for today. I hope you all enjoyed it without spiking your blood pressure too much. You know I care about your health, right? With that, thank you all so much for watching to the end. If you like this content and you want to support it, be sure to like and subscribe. If you want to do more, I'm so grateful. I'm on Utreon, Patreon, Subscribestar. I've got affiliate links and other links down below that help hugely. Until next time, y'all take care. Thank you.